Thank you very much, Melanie. Merci beaucoup, Melanie. Puis on voulait remercier le directeur parlementaire du budget qui a répondu à la demande que Laurel et moi en a faite il y a quelques mois pour avoir une révision, une mise à jour sur toutes les considérations économiques et financières sur l'oléoduc Trans Mountain, un projet qui est extrêmement controversé. Puis on se rappelle que un dernier rapport du directeur parlementaire du budget a évalué qu'on a payé en tant que contribuable $1 milliard de trop dans l'achat de la compagnie. Aujourd'hui, qu'est-ce que M. Giroux et son équipe a fait? C'est de faire une analyse de tous les scénarios possibles à l'égard de Trans Mountain. Il y a des choses surprenantes qui sortent de cet élément-là. D'abord, et ils ont évalué la question de rentabilité de l'oléoduc Trans Mountain dans un scénario où il n'y a aucun changement dans les politiques vis-à-vis les changements climatiques. Et mon collègue Laurel va en parler plus, mais la réalité, c'est que dans un scénario idéal pour la compagnie, où il n'y a aucun changement, même pas le projet de loi C12, là, cette rentabilité est même pas établie. Ça, c'est quelque chose qui est surprenant, qui sort de cette évaluation. Deuxièmement, ils ont fait des scénarios, à peu près une centaine. Il y a plusieurs que M. Giroux a évalués comme fantaisistes, des scénarios qui étaient pas crédibles, comme par exemple une réduction dans le coût de construction et un scénario où tout le projet est complété dans un scénario idéal aussi des prix de pétrole. Dans les scénarios plus réalistes, là, on parle d'un projet qui sera vraiment établi autour de 13,9 milliards de dollars. Autrement dit, une augmentation déjà de 10% par rapport aux dernières chiffre établi pour le prix de construction et dans un scénario où le projet est complété autour du 31 décembre 2023. Dans ces scénarios plus réalistes, on parle de seulement un scénario sur 18 où le projet est rentable. Alors, on parle d'une situation qui indique très clairement qu'on part d'un projet qui n'est pas rentable, qui est payé par les contribuables. Et alors aujourd'hui, l'NPD est simplement en train de dire à M. Trudeau, il faut cesser de jouer cette jeu de hasard avec Trans Mountain. Il faut mieux investir ces 20 milliards de dollars dans l'énergie propre, ce qui va créer beaucoup plus d'emplois au Canada. So thank you all for being here. We thank the parliamentary budget officer for again doing a very careful and important analysis of Trans Mountain Pipeline. And you'll recall that it's the PBO that did the initial report that showed that Canadian taxpayers had paid $1 billion more than they should have for the purchase of the company. Today, the scenarios that are put out, there's nearly 100. Several are qualified by Mr. Giroux as being fantasies, simply not credible types of scenarios. But among the most realistic, based on what is considered a 10% rise in the cost of construction, around $13.9 billion, and a completion date prior to December 31st, 2023, in those cases, out of the 18 different scenarios based on the types of contracts that are issued and the long-term discount rate, we're actually talking about 1 in 18 where the project is actually viable and makes money for taxpayers. So given how this analysis, very careful analysis, shows that in the case of the rise of construction costs, Canadian taxpayers being on the hook potentially for $18.5 billion now, if you include the price of acquisition of the company. We're simply calling on Mr. Trudeau today to stop rolling the dice on Trans Mountain. What we really need to do is invest this money in clean energy production. What that means, of course, is far more jobs for the Canadian economy. And so we're asking Mr. Trudeau, stop rolling the dice on Trans Mountain. I'll turn things over to my colleague, Laurel Collins.
Thanks, Peter. And I want to echo the thanks to the Parliamentary Budget Officer for his hard work on this and his team's hard work. Today's report clearly shows that any scenario in which Trans Mountain is profitable is actually a fantasy, and especially if we are looking at the government's own commitments to climate action. If we take any of those actions, this project becomes less and less and less viable. And even if we were to look at the scenario we are in right now, without taking climate action, the most likely scenario is that this project becomes unviable. It's barely profitable as is. I think what really concerns me is the kind of duplicity that we're seeing from the Liberal government right now, where on the one hand, they're proposing Bill C-12, climate accountability action, saying that this is the direction that we're going to move in, that we're actually going to start meeting our climate targets, that we're actually going to start investing in the kind of green infrastructure, retrofits, public transit that would create good, sustainable jobs from coast to coast to coast, while at the same time protecting our environment and our climate. But on the other hand, they have bought a pipeline. They are now pushing ahead with it, even though over 100 economists have written to them saying this project doesn't make sense. Now, the Parliamentary Budget Officer has put forward a report outlining the different scenarios. And in a quarter of those scenarios, the project is viable. In 3/4 of those scenarios, the project is unviable. And the Parliamentary Budget Officer has admitted that in that quarter where the projects are viable are the ones that are the least likely. They are the ones that really, something magical, something incredible would have to happen for the costs to go down, the cost of constructions to go down. Something magical would have to happen for the project to be finished early. What we need to be doing right now is investing in green infrastructure, in clean energy, in public transit, in the kind of solutions we know are going to move us towards meeting our climate targets, taking action to protect our environment, and for creating the kind of good jobs we know Canadians need right now. This is, $4.5 billion as a purchasing price. It's now 12.6. Likely those costs are going to increase as we see increased delays because of COVID-19, but also just regular construction delays over the course of the lifetime of this project so far. We've seen increased costs, increased delays, and we are likely going to be seeing those same trends in the future. And so this project is an economic disaster, it is an environmental disaster, and I think the government has some explaining to do why they would continue to push forward with this project at this time.
So avec ça, est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Are there any questions? Thank you for being with us today.
Merci, Peter. On va commencer avec David Thurton. We're going to start with David Thurton from the CBC. A reminder that if you have a question, you can send me a message in the chat and we can call on you next. So David, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for doing this. David Thurton, CBC News. The overall conclusion of the report, though, is that the investment remains profitable. So Trans Mountain's going to say that that's good news. The proponents of this pipeline is going to say that this is good news. So I guess, do you see it that way?
Well, Mr. Giroux said that we're talking about the barely profitable, and that is the scenario before we go to the expansion. And I think the bottom line is, yes, Trans Mountain has a history of not being transparent. We saw this most recently on COVID-19 expenses, but it's hard to spin a table that indicates that in almost every realistic case, Trans Mountain is money loser, and so what that indicates, I think, should indicate to the Canadian public, is that this is not a good investment. Mr. Trudeau was very spontaneous when the private sector was walking away from the expansion project, coughed up $1 billion more in taxpayers' money than he should have, even with the company evaluation. And now we have a situation where very, very clearly, under the realistic scenarios, this company and this project will be losing money. I think the PBO needs to be listened to, and I think the Canadian public need to be listened to when they say to Mr. Trudeau, you can't keep throwing money at this project when there are much more important uses for it. And certainly Jagmeet Singh and the NDP caucus have outlined a number of investments that we should be making now, as Laurel mentioned. Clean energy is fundamentally important, and those kinds of investments create far more jobs.
Are you disappointed that the PBO didn't really consider future climate policy, particularly, that Canada wants to achieve net zero by 2050?
I think given that this Bill C-12 has just come out, I understand why the Parliamentary Budget Officer wouldn't be able to include some of those calculations, but he was very clear that if we take climate action, if we commit to net zero, that this project is not viable. And so I think we have seen this now from the Parliamentary Budget Officer. We've seen it from Canada's energy regulator. It should be clear to this government that if they are serious about climate action, this project doesn't make sense.
We'll go with the next question. I don't have any questions in the chat, so if anybody would like a question, go ahead and unmute yourself to ask either Peter or Laurel a question. Oui, vas-y, Catherine. Oh, t'es encore sur mute. Non. Parfait. S'il y a d'autres questions en attendant, Catherine avait envoyé par chat. If there are other questions in the meantime, we can go ahead to yours while Catherine sends hers via the chat.
Hi, it's Jordan Press from CP. I wanted to just ask, obviously, you're talking that there isn't a need now to, based on the figures in the PBO report, that you wouldn't want to see the federal government be investing in this project and investing in other things. I guess what is the message then you give to maybe people in Alberta for whom workers in the oil patch in particular are hurting from, the double whammy of this pandemic and low oil prices that already cost to them? What's your message to them when you're at the same time that you're saying, well, we shouldn't invest in this, and they're hoping that actually we do invest to help them in their jobs and help pay for, be able to put food on the tables for their families? I guess what's your message to those workers?
Well, Jordan, I'll let Laurel go first, and then I'll. Yep, go ahead.
I was just going to say, even before COVID-19 hit, we were seeing huge job losses in Alberta. 19,000 workers lost their jobs in 1 month. And, we need to be supporting these workers to ensure they have long-term family-sustaining jobs for the future. And we know that it is, as my colleague Peter Julian said, it's rolling the dice on Trans Mountain. We know this project isn't profitable. We know that this is throwing good money after bad. We need to be actually providing the kind of long-term jobs for people in Alberta and for people from coast to coast to coast. And what that means is investing in clean energy, in green infrastructure, in public transit. We've seen recently developments in Saskatchewan for geothermal. A lot of the same skills that oil and gas workers are going to be applicable in the low carbon jobs in renewable energy. And so we need to actually have a plan for a just transition for these workers. And this Liberal government promised that they were going to put forward a just transition plan, but where is it? Where we haven't seen anything, and it's not surprising that workers in Alberta are disillusioned and skeptical of this Liberal government when they haven't actually taken the action, when they actually haven't invested in the low carbon economy in a way that would create those kinds of jobs. Peter?
Oh, thanks, Laurel. Well, Jordan, as you probably know, I was an energy worker in the energy sector. I worked at the Shelburne Oil Refinery in Burnaby, BC. It's now closed. And so we feel acutely that we need to start putting in place the investments so energy workers can transition to clean energy, as Laurel says. The reality is with the potential for geothermal and solar in Alberta could be a clean energy powerhouse, but we're not seeing any leadership from the federal government on this at all. They continue to subsidize oil and gas executives, CEOs. They want to spend enormous amounts of money on Trans Mountain, even though it's not commercially viable or economically viable. That's why the private sector walked away. We want to see those supports going directly to energy workers for clean energy. And I've spoken to energy workers in Alberta. They're very excited about that potential. They just don't see any leadership from the federal government right now. And for Mr. Trudeau to say, well, we're going to deal with the climate emergency, but at the same time build the pilot, this pipeline project, even though it's not viable, just shows the immense contradiction. The government has to stop rolling the dice with energy workers and with this pipeline project and really put in place a viable long-term strategy for energy workers and the clean energy sector.
And I would just direct, Jordan, you to page 6 of the PBO's report, where they talk about employment impacts from the construction activities of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, that they'll actually peak in 2021. So we're really looking to have those long-term sustainable jobs.
I did have a follow-up question, but I see that my colleague Catherine has been able to get her question into the chat room. So maybe I'll let her go first since I jumped in before she did.
I think I muted myself now.
Oh!
Oui, bonjour.
Wow. Salut!
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Julian et Madame Collins. Je m'excuse, je suis arrivée un peu en retard. J'avais oublié que c'était sur Zoom. Alors, je voulais juste savoir, tout d'abord, avoir votre réaction en français, quitte à vous faire répéter, sur les conclusions du rapport de Monsieur Giroux. Et qu'est-ce que vous pensez qu'on devrait faire, en fait, avec le projet dans l'immédiat?
Mais d'abord, les conclusions sont très évidentes. S'il y a des politiques pour contrer les changements climatiques, ce projet est pas rentable. On sait que c'est déjà le cas. C12, même si c'est faible à plusieurs égards, ça fait en sorte que déjà la rentabilité est mise en question. Et quand on regarde l'ensemble des scénarios, sauf pour les scénarios les plus fantaisistes où les coûts de construction diminuent, le projet est complété, tout va bien, il y a c'est un paradis pour l'avenir pétrolier. Si on met à côté toutes ces fantasies dans les scénarios les plus réalistes, c'est 5% de chance que ça soit rentable. Ça indique que effectivement, le gouvernement fédéral a un choix à faire, une décision à prendre. Et je pense, avec tout le travail que le directeur parlementaire du budget a fait, le meilleur choix, c'est de dire on va cesser de jeter de l'argent par-dessus ce projet-là, puis on va investir dans l'énergie propre, où il y a beaucoup plus de potentiel d'emploi. Et il faut dire, avec le changement, même avant le changement pour l'administration Biden aux États-Unis, on prévoyait déjà une multiplication dans les sources d'énergie propre aux États-Unis. Autrement dit, d'ici 10 ans, on va quadrupler le marché de l'énergie propre aux États-Unis. Là, maintenant, avec l'administration Biden, on sait que ça va augmenter encore plus. Alors, le Canada devrait se préparer pour ça et le gouvernement fédéral devrait investir pour établir l'infrastructure, le réseau intelligent qui fait en sorte qu'on peut fournir ces exportations vers le marché américain. Ça sera le choix à faire et ça sera beaucoup plus sage que de continuer à faire de jouer ce jeu d'hasard avec 20 milliards de dollars des contribuables sur un oléoduc qui n'est pas rentable dans presque tous les scénarios réalistes.
Donc, juste pour être clair, si je comprends bien, on devrait canceller le projet dès maintenant. C'est ce que vous dites, quitte à payer des frais dans l'immédiat.
Mais la réalité, c'est plus qu'on jette de l'argent sur ce projet-là, plus ça devient difficile d'annuler le projet. Mais étant donné l'opposition du gouvernement provincial en Colombie-Britannique, l'opposition des Premières Nations, l'opposition des municipalités comme Burnaby et Vancouver, le fait que c'est pas un projet rentable et que ça va augmenter l'impact des gaz à effet de serre, c'est une décision logique que est beaucoup plus sage que de continuer à jeter de l'argent sur ce projet-là qui n'est pas rentable selon quasiment tous les scénarios.
Jordan, did you want to go ahead with your follow-up?
Yeah, if I could, it's just to clarify something, because you keep talking about not throwing more money after bad and what to do with this pipeline over time, but it sounds like then the government is still going to be stuck with this asset. It's still going to be stuck with a $4.4 billion pipeline at purchase that is not going to make money, and in fact it could end up losing money. So I guess then what exactly then do you want to see happen to this pipeline, given that it is quite likely, instead of maybe a $1.5 billion loss or whatever it may be, that Canadians could end up losing, or taxpayers could end up losing $4.4 billion or even more money out of this?
Well, I mean, Mr. Trudeau has always said that his desire was to sell it to the private sector. I think that is a fantasy, given the figures that are in the report itself. And so this is, it is not just the cost of acquisition of the company. Construction is starting to ramp up. This would be a prudent moment for the government to make the right choice. But we're also talking about the cost of climate change. And I know Laurel will want to add more to this, but it's evaluated this year, the impact on the economy of $5 billion. We know over the next decade or two, that will rise to $50 billion a year. So there are a whole range of costs that have to be considered. It was a mistake for Mr. Trudeau in 24 hours to come up with $4.5 billion and throw that at the company. It would be a bigger mistake to say, okay, now that he made this initial mistake, let's keep pouring money, taxpayers' money, into this project, even though it is almost in all the scenarios that are realistic, it is going to be a money loser. And at a time of pandemic, when so many Canadians are struggling to put food on the table, to keep a roof over their head, for Mr. Trudeau to throw so much money at a project that is not viable seems to be really the height of irresponsibility. He should take the conclusions that the PBO has laid forward and stop rolling the dice with significant amounts of taxpayers' money, so we can invest it in more sustainable long-term growth and job creation.
And really, I don't have much to add to that. I think the key piece here is that money could be spent on something that would be more profitable and would benefit Canadians in this, time of immense need. We're seeing communities and families across Canada struggle. We need to be investing in a just and sustainable recovery. And this money right now, we are putting into a project that we know isn't going to be viable. If we take any amount of climate action, we know this project is not going to be viable. If there is a year delay, we know this project isn't going to be viable. In the vast majority of likely scenarios, this project is not viable. So why not invest those billions of dollars into the kind of job creation, the kind of supports for Canadians that are so needed right now?
Do we have any questions from the media? Any more questions? Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions? Des questions des médias? If you have a question, you can either send me a note, you can raise your hand function, or you can just take yourself off of mute and go ahead. Let's give it a few more seconds here, and then we can conclude if there are no other questions from media. Oh, I've got a question here. The report assumes that the shippers will renew their contracts on similar terms when they expire in 2042. This renewal is one of the scenarios required to make TMX profitable. How likely is it that the shippers renew their contracts in the 2040s?
It's a great question, and the issue of as construction costs appear to be climbing, as we've mentioned earlier. It's a $13.9 billion scenario that seems most likely in this particular report, though Mr. Giroux also indicates that costs could climb beyond that. That also allows shippers, as you know, with the current toll structure, to actually renegotiate their contracts. So the more optimistic scenarios are the least likely, and that's why this is just another reason why this roll of the dice seems to be quite irresponsible. The issue of cost of service and shifting to that model in virtually every single scenario, this is a money loser. In fact, I think there's only one of 50. One of 50, the scenario on the table that the PBO very helpfully lays out. There's only one case, and that's in the fantasy that the construction costs are actually 10% lower than currently projected. So we're talking about a massive number of different impacts of different decisions, whether we're talking about shippers, increase in construction costs, a more likely completion date. In all of those cases, it simply turns the pipeline into a money loser. It is barely making money now, and that's in a more optimistic scenario. So the shippers' ability to renegotiate those contracts are yet another element, as well as Laurel mentioning any action taken against climate change, that simply make this project an absolute roll of the dice with taxpayers' money that Canadians cannot afford.
Any other questions? Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions? And a reminder that anybody who's looking for the full recording of the press conference, we can send your way. Un petit rappel que si vous voulez une copie de le point de presse au complet, on peut vous l'envoyer. Okay, I'll count to 10 in my head, and if nobody has replied, we'll conclude this press conference.
And if I can just add, in an hour and a half, we will be on the pipeline route in British Columbia doing a local press conference. So for any national media that want to send cameras, you would be you're very welcome. 10 a.m. at Hume Park in Westminster, and we'll send that around. Alors pour les médias nationaux qui veulent envoyer des appareils ou des appareils de photo, en fait, sur la route de Trans Mountain ou sur la route projetée au Parc Hume à New Westminster à partir de 10 heures ce matin, heure de Pacifique.
Great. I think that's it, Peter. Merci beaucoup.